Settle in, young'un, 'cause this ain't a short tale. This is a story about a man who was more legend than flesh. A man who could talk to the wind and walk through storms like they were summer breezes. His name was Elias Harper, and he was my grandfather's best friend. Or at least, that's how Grandpappy told him. Back in the days when the railroad was still stretching its iron arms across the country and folks were just starting to tame the land, Elias came to our little town of Willow Bend. Nobody knew where he came from, just that one day the wind picked up something fierce, and when the dust settled, there he was, tall as a pine, with a coat that flapped like crow wings and eyes like a brewing storm. Now, most folks, they didn't take too kindly to strangers back then, especially ones that carried stories on their backs like old saddlebags. But Grandpappy, he was different. He had a way of knowing when someone was worth listening to. So when Elias Harper strode into the general store, all quiet-like, and asked for nothing more than a bit of bread and water, Grandpappy stepped up and said, "Stranger, I got a feeling you've been walking a long road. Why don't you sit a spell and tell me about it?" Elias just smiled, one of those slow, knowing smiles that don't reach the eyes, and said, "I'd be much obliged." That was the start of something neither of them could have foreseen. Elias Harper didn't talk much at first. He was the kind of man who let silence do the heavy lifting, speaking only when words had weight. But over time, Grandpappy got bits and pieces out of him. Said he'd been walking near 20 years, drifting from town to town, never staying long. Now, that alone wasn't all that strange. There were plenty of drifters back then, men chasing work or running from something. But Elias was different. It wasn't just the way he carried himself, like he belonged nowhere and everywhere all at once. It was the way the wind seemed to follow him. Grandpappy swore on his life that the first night Elias stayed in Willow Bend, the weather changed. It had been a dry spell before that, the kind that cracked the ground and made the air taste like dust. But that night, the wind picked up, gentle at first, like a whisper rustling through the trees. By morning, the clouds had rolled in, and sure enough, rain followed. Folks called it coincidence, but Grandpappy wasn't so sure. Elias took up work at the old sawmill, just for a spell. He never asked for more than what he needed, just enough to keep himself fed and maybe a place to sleep in the loft above the general store. The townfolk, well, they didn't quite know what to make of him. Some said he had the look of an outlaw, but he never carried a gun. Others reckoned he was some kind of preacher, though he never spoke of God, just of the road and the way the wind moves. One evening, Grandpappy asked him straight out, "Elias, why is it you don't stay nowhere too long?" Elias was quiet for a moment, staring out at the horizon like he was listening for something only he could hear. Then he said, "Some men are made to put down roots. Others, we're meant to keep moving." That answer sat with Grandpappy for a long time. But the real trouble started when the storms came. Now, like I said, the real trouble started when the storms came. Not just any storms, neither. These were the kind that rolled in black as the devil's own coat, with thunder that shook the ground and lightning that split trees clean in half. Folks in Willow Bend were used to rough weather, but this was something else. 3 nights in a row, the wind howled like a banshee, tearing shingles off roofs and rattling windows in their panes. The river, which had been bone dry for weeks, suddenly swelled and churned like it was trying to crawl out of its banks. The cattle got skittish, dogs wouldn't stop barking, And even the old folks, who'd seen every kind of storm, started crossing themselves when they looked at the sky. And through it all, Elias Harper just stood there, coat flapping in the wind, eyes fixed on the storm like he was listening to something no one else could hear. GrandPappy found him on the edge of town, standing under the big oak tree by the river. The wind was tearing through the branches, but Elias didn't flinch. "You look like a man expecting company," GrandPappy said, his voice nearly lost in the roar of the storm. Elias didn't turn his head, just kept his gaze on the dark horizon. "It's coming," he said. GrandPappy frowned. "What's coming?" Elias let out a slow breath. "Something old. Something I've been running from a long time." Now, GrandPappy wasn't the kind of man to scare easy, but there was something in Elias's voice that sent a chill down his spine, colder than the wind itself. He didn't ask no more questions. He just stood there with Elias, watching the storm roll in. That night, the worst of it hit. The wind screamed through the town, tearing down fences, snapping power lines, and sending tin roofs flying like leaves in the wind. The church bell rang out on its own, clanging wildly as if warning folks of something more than just bad weather. And in the middle of it all, Elias Harper disappeared. When the storm finally passed, the town was a mess. Trees down, roofs torn clean off, the river swollen near to bursting. Folks were already picking through the wreckage, shaking their heads and counting their blessings that no one had been killed. But GrandPappy, he wasn't thinking about the storm damage. No, sir. He was thinking about Elias Harper. See, when the wind died down, Elias was nowhere to be found. His room above the general store was empty, his old coat gone from the nail where he always hung it. There weren't no tracks leading out of town, no sign that he'd packed up and left like a normal man. It was as if the storm had come and carried him off with it. Now, GrandPappy wasn't the only one who noticed. Folks started whispering. Some said Elias was bad luck, that he'd brought the storm with him. Others swore up and down they'd seen him out in the fields when the lightning struck, standing there with his arms outstretched, like he was calling the wind to him. Mrs. Jenkins, who ran the bakery, told anyone who'd listen that she saw Elias walking straight into the heart of the storm, his shadow stretching long against the lightning. Then, just like that, he was gone. Most folks chalked it up to nerves and fear, but GrandPappy, he wasn't so sure, so he went looking. Now, GrandPappy wasn't a fool. He knew better than to go chasing storms, but something about Elias's last words stuck in his head. Something old. Something I've been running from a long time. So he saddled up his old mare, Bessie, packed himself a satchel with some biscuits and jerky, and followed the river out of town. If Elias had gone anywhere, that was the likeliest path. The wind always seemed to pull him toward the wild places, and there weren't nothing wilder than the hills beyond Willow Bend. For 3 days, GrandPappy rode, through the thick woods, across the high plains, past places where the land still felt untouched, like it was waiting for something. He saw no tracks, no sign that Elias had passed that way, just the wind, always the wind, whispering through the trees. Then, on the 4th day, he found it. Deep in the hills, where the land sloped down into a narrow valley, there stood an old shack. It looked like it had been there forever, leaning crooked like the wind had been pushing at it for 100 years. The wood was grey, the roof sagging, but there was smoke curling up from the chimney. And standing out front, as if he'd been waiting all along, was Elias Harper. Grandpappy reined in his horse at the edge of the clearing, staring at that shack like it held the answers to questions he wasn't sure he wanted to ask. The air was still, too still. Not a leaf stirred, not a bird called. Even the wind, which had been his constant companion on the ride, had gone silent, as if it too was holding its breath. And then Elias turned. Not in any rush, not surprised to see Grandpappy sitting there in the saddle. Just turned slow and steady, like he'd been expecting him all along. His face was the same, calm, weathered, eyes sharp as ever. But there was something else now. Something in the way he stood, in the way his coat barely moved despite the whisper of a breeze. "You came a long way," Elias said, voice even as ever. Grandpappy swung down from his horse, dusted off his coat. "Reckon I did." Hard to ignore a man vanishing into a storm like that. Elias gave a slow nod, his eyes drifting to the sky. "Storm wasn't after the town, you know. It was after me." Grandpappy frowned. "That's so." Elias sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I thought maybe I'd outrun it this time. But you can't outrun the wind. You can't outrun what you are." Now, Grandpappy wasn't a man given to wild notions, but something about the way Elias said that made his stomach knot up. He took a step forward, looking Elias dead in the eye. "What are you?" Elias let out a breath, and for the first time since Grandpappy had met him, he looked tired. Not just the kind of tired a man gets from a long road, but the kind that settles in deep, the kind that don't leave. "Come inside," Elias said. "I'll tell you." The inside of the shack was sparse. A wooden table, a single chair, a cot in the corner. The walls were lined with old maps, yellowed with age, covered in markings that didn't look like any language Grandpappy had ever seen. In the center of the table sat an oil lamp, its flame flickering like it was caught between burning and going out. Elias poured 2 cups of black coffee from an old tin pot and slid one across the table. "You ever hear of the Windwalkers?" he asked. Grandpappy shook his head. Elias took a sip of coffee, staring into the flame like it held memories instead of light. "They're older than any name you know. Older than the mountains, older than the rivers. They don't belong to one place because they are the place. They're the storm on the horizon, the whisper through the trees, the hand that shifts the clouds. Some say they were once men. Others say they were never really here at all. Just something the world needed to keep moving." Grandpappy set his cup down, studying Elias. "And you?" Elias let out a slow breath. "I was born with the wind in my bones. My mother, she wasn't one of them, but my father, he was. And when you got wind in your blood, you don't get to settle down. You don't get to stay in one place too long, because the storm will always find you." Grandpappy felt a shiver creep up his spine. "That's what happened back in Willow Bend." Elias nodded. "I tried to stay too long. I got comfortable. The wind don't like that." Outside, a breeze picked up, rattling the old shutters. Elias glanced toward the window, eyes dark. "It's always looking for me. If I stay, it'll tear this place apart, just like it almost did back in town." Grandpappy frowned. "You saying the storm?" Elias cut him off with a look. "I ain't saying nothing except this. I gotta keep moving. If I don't, people get hurt." Grandpappy sat there a long while, turning Elias's words over in his head. He didn't know if he believed them, but then again, he didn't not believe them either. He thought about the way the wind had always followed Elias, how it had changed the moment he arrived. He thought about the storm, the lightning, the way the river had risen like something unnatural had stirred it awake. And he thought about the way Elias had looked at that storm, not with fear, not with anger, but with something close to understanding. "What happens if it catches you?" Grandpappy asked. Elias was quiet for a long moment. Then, soft as a breath, he said, "Then I become part of it." The wind outside howled, rattling the walls. Elias set his cup down, stood. "You should go. Storm's coming." Grandpappy hesitated. He didn't like leaving a man behind, especially not a man who'd saved him from worse than one bar brawl in their time together. But something in Elias's face told him there wasn't another way. So he stood, tipped his hat and said, "You take care now, Elias." Elias nodded. "You too." Grandpappy stepped outside, saddled up his horse and rode off without looking back. But as he crossed the ridge, the wind picked up again, fiercer than before. The sky darkened, thunder rumbled in the distance, and just before the rain came down, Grandpappy swore he heard something in the wind. A voice. Not words exactly, just a whisper, low and knowing, like the breath of an old friend disappearing into the storm. And when he finally did look back, the shack was gone. Not broken, not burned, just gone, like it had never been there at all. Now, that's the story as Grandpappy told it, and I reckon there's no one left to say different. Folks still talk about Elias Harper in hushed voices, some saying he was just a drifter, others swearing up and down that he was something more. But me, on nights when the wind howls through the trees, when the storm rattles the windows and the air hums with something old, I like to think Elias is still out there somewhere, walking the ridges, chasing the wind, because some men ain't meant to stay in one place. Some men are the storm. That's the end of this yarn, young'un, but the wind's still blowing.